As we saw in the previous module, Ignaz Semmelweis was condemned by the medical establishment he was trying to save. His data was impeccable, but his findings were dismissed as absurd. Semmelweis had facts, but he didn't have what the authorities of his time would accept as knowledge. The question of what counts as legitimate knowledge is closely entangled with the question of what counts as a legitimate source of knowledge. How should we distinguish between genuine knowledge and mere belief? Between knowing that something is the case and simply thinking that something is the case? And who gets to make that distinction? For over 2,000 years since Plato, philosophers have defined knowledge as justified true belief. You possess genuine knowledge when three conditions have been met. You believe that something is true, that something is true, and you have good reasons for believing that it's true. Of the three, justification tends to be the most contested criterion. What actually counts as a good reason for belief? We'll examine two different paths to answering that question. Both paths understand knowledge in terms of foundations. For knowledge to be justified, it needs to come from a trusted source. There should be some bedrock of certainty upon which it rests. The first path is rationalism. Rationalists locate the foundations for truth in logical necessity. Trustworthy ideas should be clear and distinct. They should flow deductively downward from rational first principles before being applied to specific cases. Rationalism tends to favor mathematics, logic, and a priori reasoning that is independent of experience. Certainty is built into reason itself, and we can therefore use reason to arrive at innate ideas that are necessarily true. If no humans existed to count things, 2 plus 2 would still equal 4. Empiricism, on the other hand, takes the path of inductive reasoning. Knowledge comes from experience. We build it, experience by experience, observing patterns and noticing which patterns tend to happen most often and most consistently. Specific cases provide the foundations from which we generalize out to universal principles. Mathematical proofs like 2 plus 2 equals 4 are generalizations from our experience of countable objects in the world. The rationalist story begins with Plato. By the writing of the Meno, Plato's distinct philosophical voice is starting to emerge. Socrates at this point should be considered more of a literary device for describing Platonic philosophy. In the dialogue, Socrates faces Meno's paradox. How can you search for knowledge if you don't already possess it? The search for knowledge implies that knowledge is lacking. But if you don't possess knowledge, then how would you recognize it if you found it? By definition, you don't know what you're looking for. To respond to the paradox, Socrates provides a demonstration. An uneducated slave is shown to be able to arrive at a geometrical proof through minimal prompting. Setting aside the normalization of slavery and class elitism, which were unfortunately common in ancient Greece, this demonstration is intended to illustrate Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection, an early example of the innate ideas hypothesis. The geometrical proofs are already present in our minds. We don't learn them from experience, we recognize them as the structure of our own reasoning. Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection sets the stage, but it's the French philosopher René Descartes who brings rationalism into focus during the early modern period. When Descartes was writing, Galileo had recently been persecuted for heresy by the Catholic Church. There was a dangerous tension between the Aristotelian assumptions of established church doctrine and the emerging mechanistic science that viewed the universe as precise, deterministic, and predictable clockwork. Descartes wanted both to preserve the emerging science from religion and simultaneously salvage concepts like free will and the human soul from the deterministic clockwork. He was also motivated to save himself from the church. Descartes' methodological innovation was to use skepticism as a tool to discover certainty. Contrasted with Socrates' dialectical method, Descartes set out literally from his armchair to systematically critique every category of belief, destroying the foundations for any belief that admitted even the slightest possibility of doubt. Our senses? They've deceived us too often to be trusted. Think about submerging a straight stick halfway into water. The stick looks bent in the water, but we know that the stick is really straight. The bent appearance is an illusion, a deception of the senses. And we've all been fooled at some time or another by dreams that seem just like waking life. What about arithmetic and geometry? These seem stronger, but a powerful enough force, a malicious demon or a malevolent AI, could in theory deceive us even about these. And so it goes, one by one, until at last one clear and distinct idea remains. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The very act of doubting confirms the existence of a doubter. This is bedrock. If our thoughts can deceive us, then there must be some thinker capable of being deceived. By attempting to doubt this, we prove it necessarily true. And so Descartes discovers his bedrock of certainty, the res cogitans, or thinking substance, by methodologically subtracting the entire material world, what he calls the res extensa, or the extended substance, everything that has location, mass, or volume. Richard Rorty describes this move as the invention of the modern mind. By demolishing everything outside of the thinking subject, Descartes invents a separate inner space where all mental events occur. This has become our common sense understanding of the mind, but this wasn't always the case. Before Descartes, the Aristotelian concept of mind involved something like the direct apprehension of the structure of the world. The Aristotelian mind was world-involving. After Descartes, the mind stood outside of the world and observed it. John Dewey calls this the spectator theory of knowledge. The thinking substance is severed from the extended substance. Descartes knows he exists, but he can only think about the external world. He's certain of his internal states, but can only form hypotheses about anything outside of them. We have now entered what Daniel Dennett calls the Cartesian Theater. The Cartesian self is immaterial. It's what remains when material qualities like mass and location have been subtracted. And what this immaterial thinking substance is thinking about is ideas. Ideas play across the theater of the mind, and the inner, isolated self observes and judges and evaluates them. A ghostly audience trapped in an internal cinema. Descartes' method of radical doubt was enormously influential, but not everyone was convinced. The English philosopher John Locke rejected Descartes' innate ideas hypothesis. Knowledge comes from living in a world of experience. You can't radical doubt yourself into learning how to swim. Locke thus sets up empiricism as an alternative specifically designed to overturn Cartesian rationalism. The world to Locke is a realm of forces and powers, where objects impress themselves upon our senses through causal interaction. The mind begins as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, waiting to be inscribed by the blade of experience. So how does the world inscribe ideas upon the blank slate of our minds? Objects in the world have primary qualities, like size, shape, and motion. These belong to the objects themselves, but the objects also possess secondary qualities that produce sensations in us that show up as ideas like color, taste, and smell. Primary qualities are objective, secondary qualities are subjective. A brown table really is solid. It would be solid even if no one encountered it, but it only appears brown under certain conditions and to certain kinds of observers. Genuine knowledge about the world then involves determining how well our internal representations correspond to external objects. This is known as the correspondence theory of truth. An idea is true insofar as it resembles its external object. Notice that even as Locke rejects Descartes' innateness hypothesis, he has implicitly adopted Descartes' inner theater starting point for the mind. What Locke gives us is a good empiricist story about how the movie gets projected onto the screen of the theater. We don't perceive objects directly, we perceive the ideas that they cause in us. The world projects images onto consciousness through sensations, and the mind reflects on these simple images, shaping them ultimately into all the complex ideas that we will ever have. This idea has been remarkably resilient, considering it's only 400 years old. Centuries later, Bertrand Russell will again consider the illusion of the bent stick in water and conclude that our inner representation of the world is constructed out of individual atoms of what he calls sense data. Atomic units of sensation that combine to paint a world across our minds. We never encounter the real stick, only our representation of it. The brown table is just patches of brown sense data that have been organized into a brown table experience by our mental processing. A veil of perception hangs always between mind and world, and there is no way to ever get to the reality beyond the veil. It was the Irish bishop George Berkeley who originally pointed out the logical conclusion of Locke's theory. If all we know are ideas, and ideas exist only in minds, then the only thing that we can ever know is more ideas. There's no sense of a primary quality that we can possibly have other than an idea of it. There isn't anything coherent that we can say about the objects that cause the ideas, because we will always just be talking about more ideas. We never actually get to the part where our belief in the external object itself gets justified by the experience of the representation. And if the existence of the external world isn't justified by our experience, then there's no need to suppose that an external world exists. It's ideas all the way down. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived, and nothing besides. This view is called immaterialism or subjective idealism, and this is where Russell leaves us as well. Whatever it is that we have knowledge of, it isn't a mind-independent reality. What about science? We can test things to see if they're real. We might not reach Cartesian certainty, but we can reach a justified inference to the best explanation based on repeated corroboration acquired via hypothesis testing. In the next lecture, we'll see how a Scotsman named David Hume takes even that justification away from us. And I'll see you there.